Does academia have a problem with left-wing politics? And I'm going to tell you the straight answer right now is that nah, but there are differences in how people view the world. I'm going to sort of think about this in terms of why I think that there are differences within academia. So if you don't know me, I am Professor Dave Masek. I'm Associate Professor of Innovation Strategy and Entrepreneurship, and I created this whole Reciprocity Project to give back as much as I possibly can. All right, so left-wing politics, this is a sort of general idea that I know. I'm not a politician. Frankly, politics makes me barf. But what I'm going to suggest is that there is differences within different disciplines within academia. Sometimes they are more left-leaning as individuals, but the research itself generally is not left-wing. And the reason is that it has to be vetted through a scientific process. And it's very hard to get through the scientific process where you have other people looking at what you're trying to do. And they're typically, at least in my field, is that there's typically right-wing people that will counterbalance what you're actually saying. And so it's actually hard to get through with a left-wing story or something that has a certain bias. Now, that doesn't mean in lower-end journals that people really don't care about and don't read, I apologize for those who are publishing in very low-tier journals. I'm talking about super low ones. Doesn't mean that stuff doesn't generate different biases. There's left-wing and right-wing biases in those as well, right? Like there are these particular biases. But what we look for in general within the scientific research is something that is not necessarily balanced. I don't think that is a story, but collectively it's somewhat balanced. It's really about talking of what is really going on behind the scenes and what is interesting. Those two things are really important, right? So it's got to be valid and reliable, but it also has to be interesting, which I think sometimes runs us astray. And so the research tends to be pretty kind of boring, to be honest. If you read it, you're going to be bored silly. And you might hear sort of snippets of people saying that there's these sort of left-wing biases that happen. So where do those come from? And I think I have a bit of a philosophy on that, right? So generally, I think what's happening is that a lot of academics, perhaps even myself, view that we can impact the world and that the stuff that we do matters. And so by default, that means that we have to have a market maker. That means we have to have some sort of policy person. That means we have to have a government, for example, something that is, implementing some of these plans. Now, I think generally, if you were to look at, and I think the research sort of bears this from what I understand, I don't know it that much, but from what I understand, the fields that recognize a market, so finance and economics, they're not going to view that as much. And I think the reason is, and I kind of agree, is once you get out there and you do it, you realize that there's so much that goes on behind the scenes that you can't necessarily understand everything, right? So if you're to view the world as a more of a complex system where there's many people interweaving, interlocking, it's hard to understand what's going on behind the scenes. And so even people that are very, very smart and have done a lot, I want you to think about this, right? So part of my research area is to study failure, disasters, things like that, right? So we have very, very smart, intentional people building things like rocket ships that go up into space or refineries, for example. But every once in a while, those rocket ships fall down and they break. Or every once in a while, an oil refinery explodes. Well, what can we explain that, or how can we explain that? Part of that is thinking of that as a complex system, that we can't understand everything at all times. And admitting that is a really important understanding that I think a lot of academics and researchers have a hard time admitting, that we just don't understand everything, including myself, right? Like that's just why I'm actually talking about this, right? Like, I think I have something to say, but, does that something to say, does it matter? Is it valid? No, absolutely not. But hopefully it gives you a bit of an insight. So I think, like, the whole left-wing thing, I think, honestly, sometimes there's talking points that people like to gravitate on, and they'll talk about the talking points, and they'll forget about the whole story. They'll not look at those. So I would just be careful if anybody is painting a wide picture of anything, of the way that the world actually works, because it's a lot more complicated than you ever think. Like, a better picture of viewing what goes on in academia, viewing what goes on in research, is herding cats. I really, really want you to think about that. You've got a bunch of very smart, intelligent people that all have their own opinions, and they think that the world should be this over that. And they all feel like that, right? So if you were to talk to a president of a university, a chair, a department chair, or anybody that interacts with all of these big heads, right? Like, that's essentially who we are. If you interact with them, right, all these people that have these big egos, you're going to realize, like, oh my gosh, I can't get nothing done. And it's a lot harder to think about any of those things. So I want you to really think about that. There is no one picture of the world that academics and researchers do. It's a plethora. It reflects the beauty of society that we have. It reflects the world, all individual sort of beliefs and understandings that we have, and it's kind of a microcosm. We're kind of like, another way to view academia is kind of just rigorous journalism that is trying to report what they actually see. And all of those things that you would imagine comes out in the scientific effort. Now, what do I mean by rigorous journalism? Well, most journalists, even if they are, the best journalists and they're doing really good reporting, they're spending a year on a project, right? No more than that. Well, academics spend decades on a project, and that is normal to go through that. So I want you to sort of think about that, take that step away. If you start hearing anything of people sort of suggesting painting a picture out of anybody, be careful. Life's complicated. That's essentially it. All right, take care and have a wonderful day. Bye.